have just put together a collection. This is from our resource library. Many of the speakers, if not most of them, are coming, or at least coming via Zoom. And so feel free to peruse the books. They do belong to our resource library purchased with Title VI fund. So without further ado, thank you, Dr. Fung.
Thanks, Susan, for inviting me to this terrific event. And I'm excited. I came in the first section earlier, and then I was sitting outside and find that it's a packed room full of energy. So I'm really looking forward to the questions and discussion. And I am also very excited to reconnect to this topic that I have done a while ago. And now I'm picking it up again because, as Susan introduced me, that I primarily research and teach on Chinese development, Asian development history from a historical perspective. And when I'm teaching it to undergraduate students, that I feel the need of more and more to actually dispel some of the misconception, preconception about Asia and China. So I get back into this topic that I have been researching on a while ago. And in the beginning, I'm puzzled about this contemporary Western, US, Europe portrayal of China, positive and negative, and find that there's some interesting things that reflect the reality of what's actually going on in China and what is actually fabricated and exaggerated. And then I go back to history to try to look at the roots of this misconception, and then find it very interesting and troubling, and seeing that this kind of misconception actually stayed for a long time. I can trace it back to the height of the Cold War and earlier, even in the earlier period, like in the 19th century. And then in the end, I trace back to the origins of many of these misconceptions. Actually, you can see the same thing being said about China and Asia in general. I'm sure that this will be the same with regard to the Middle East, because I read, and I'm sure most of you know, the Edward Said book, Orientalism, and he's talking about all these kind of a very long-standing stereotype. Actually, it dates earlier, and then it continued up into the 20th century. So it's the same for the Western conception of China. And then even before the Enlightenment, you can trace it back to many religious debate about China in the church between the Jesuits and the Gentiles in the 17th century. So to look at the contemporary representation of China, then you can see that nowadays there's a lot of admiration of China and fear of China, particularly during the trade war. And actually, this is the quote predate current. It is like 10 years old quote from a businessman. That is in China. He said they filled up hundreds of acres of land and constantly dumping dirt in the ocean. I asked the builder, "Did you get an environmental impact study?" And he goes, "What?" I asked, "Did you need approval?" No, the Chinese said. "And yet, if I'm the last guy to drop one pebble in the ocean here in this city, New York, and I will be given the electric chair." So it is speaking in the there's very kind of internal contradiction here. In one sense, it is saying that you can interpret as saying that in China there's lawlessness and people do things without much regulation and respect of the law, and at the same time that this guy is speaking in the tones of admiration, like why they're so successful in terms of business, while we are. The context is that this guy is talking about why US is not competitive anymore because we have so many regulations, so many laws, so many environmental concerns, and then while China is like speeding up in economic development and so on and so forth. So the implication is that US should be more like China, to learn from China in this regard. And then that guy is Donald Trump in 2008. It's a kind of a hospitality conference with all these hotel builders and companies and things. So he not only, actually in the same speech, he's not only talk about China, he also talk about Dubai. The same thing, that you can build things without taking into consideration of all environmental things and regulations. So US is lagging behind because we have so many of these regulations. So it is a kind of atmosphere in 2008, even before the financial crisis. But after the financial crisis, there's both of the books being published by Anne Lee, that she's I think has this financial background and write about what the US can learn from China, and open-minded guy teaching our greatest competitor as our greatest teacher. And it is bestseller, recommended by Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and then the other book is by a British journalist and writer, and he has an interesting background I don't have time to get into, because he's one of the Central Committee of the British Communist, the Communist Party of Great Britain, that is a Stalinist organization that dissolved, and then later on he became a popular writer to write this kind of book that is also recommended by the Economist, Wall Street Journal, and Financial Times back in early 2010s. So there's a lot of this book about this admiration of China. And of course, there's also the more negative view of China, that China is invading as migrants, as an economic power and political power, and spreading dictatorships, authoritarianism, and all this negative image. And you can trace it back to the 19th century, the Yellow Peril discourse, and that in this particular cartoon in the 19th century, that you can see this presumably a white working class being very worried about Chinese is coming and taking the jobs and things like that. And it is about migration, and also, of course, the parallel discourse is about China taking over the world and questioning the Western civilization. And very recently, there's a State Department official saying that now the trade war with China, between China and US, is not about trade, is about the clash of civilization. So because they are the kind of economic power which is not a Caucasian civilization, so it is they raise the level of this rivalry to a civilization or cultural level, and this kind of a fear of an authoritarian and dark but great and powerful country has been around for a long time, and it has been in our contemporary imagination. And I'm going to show a video that is controversial. It is back in 2010 midterm election. This is one of the Republican affiliated groups put this ad. They tried to put it in the TV, but it's too controversial and being accused of being racist, and they put them out, but it is still around and is telling. And you can take a quick look of this ad. Is this the audio one for this one? So let me see how you can hear. But actually, it's okay if you don't hear, because it is speaking in Chinese and everything. It is okay because it's amazing that this kind of political ad in the U.S. is not speaking English, it's speaking Chinese, and then they use subtitle to make the audience understand what is going on.
Put on closed caption. No?
Yeah, but it has subtitle itself, so
okay.
so you can know what is going on. So it is actually against Obamacare and against all this Obama-era program of stimulus, and it is interesting that they use this kind of and it's called a Chinese professor, and that is kind of spreading fear about that why so Obamacare and Obama government is so bad, because they are bankrupting America and letting the Chinese take over the world and take over us, and we allow working for China and things like that. So it is a kind of a fear. And if you have a chance to look at YouTube and listen to the music and things like that, it is really expressing kind of menacing atmosphere of like some horror of some kind of dark empire taking over us. So it has been this kind of a both positive and negative view of China that is contemporary, or at least modern, that you can find it from the 19th century. And in fact, that you look back to history, it has been around for a long time, originated in Enlightenment and even before. And actually that it is the 19th century, it's the late 19th century, the Yellow period, and it is not so clear, but in this picture, you see a cross representing Christianity, and there's an angel and leading the people to see we should defend ourselves against the threat from, you see a Buddha here, and a dark cloud. And so basically it is also the same imagination of a kind of a malicious dark empire from the east, which is China, and then the Christian civilization under threat, so we need to defend ourselves up in arms and with spears and sword and shield and things like that. So it's in late 19th century. It is kind of a king of Prussia. You see that the William II, German emperor. So it is kind of commissioned by the German emperor to try to advocate that Germany should be aware of this kind of a menace from the east and things like that. And again, you see this same thing, that in the early 20th century, you use this so-called Mongolian octopus. And they really don't distinguish between among Mongols and Japanese and Chinese. They're all the same. So they're the same kind of culture that is threatening the West. And this is during the Second World War, actually. That it is this kind of propaganda against the Japanese Empire. So again, that they don't distinguish between Japanese and Chinese, and at that time, the Chinese actually allied the U.S. during the Second World War and so on and so forth. But they used the same kind of troops and imagination to mobilize the fear of this kind of a faraway and eastern menace in the discourse of Yellow Peril. Again, that you can trace this kind of fascination between fear and negative portrayal and positive admiration about China. I start with the debate between the Jesuits and the Gentiles. And in the 17th century, there's a huge debate about China in the church back in the 17th century. And the Jesuits are the universalists, relatively cosmopolitan in kind of portraying a very positive image of China. And because at that time that the Jesuits is, the Catholic Church is countering the Reformation and trying to convert more Christians out of Europe, so the Jesuits are riding on the ships of merchants to go to different parts of the world and try to understand cultures that is non-European and try to Christianize them. And at that time, Jesuit is a group of Catholic priests who have the theories of universalism. That is, their theory is that actually God's grace is bestowed upon all human beings, regardless of culture. And in all this culture, when you trace back to the ancient version of their culture, you can see that actually they know God too. But over time, they might have lost it. So the Jesuits' method of conversion is to go to understand local culture and find these elements in the local culture that shows that this local culture actually know God, and then to extract these elements and then to emphasize that, and then to also they have this translation of Bible that actually fit into local culture as well. So when they went to China and find that that is a kind of a civilization and written language and text that lasts thousands of years, and it have a kind of a huge impact on later Enlightenment thinker like Voltaire. That I'm sure that we are going to talk about him a lot, because he grew up in a Jesuit school and got all these ideas about China from the Jesuits. So this Jesuits and Gentiles debate really affect Enlightenment thinkers' conception of China. So that when the Jesuits went to China, that they are the admirer of China, and then they wrote a lot of stuff translated into Chinese, and then to talk about Christianity in Chinese term, in Confucianist term, and then they also translate all these Chinese classics to be published back in Europe. So basically, their texts about China really dominate the early modern European imagination about what is going on in China and what Chinese culture is. So Jesuits is the kind of universalist who are admirer of China and who help spread the admiration of China. And of course, there has some political economy to it because, as you know, that in the 17th, 18th century, Asian trade, particularly China trade, is very profitable, and there's a lot of silk and porcelains being imported into Europe. Later, it became tea, but early on, it's porcelain and silk. It's very expensive. It's very admired widely. So this kind of a Jesuit admiration of Chinese civilization resonate with this material reality of this Chinese food being sought after. But the Jesuit has another idea, because it had something to do with the internal politics of the church, because the Jesuits is not happy about Jesuits expanding influence in the Catholic Church, and then they have a separate theory about God's grace, that they are the early advocate of the idea of predestination. That later on that Calvinists picked it up, but in the Catholic Church and the Jesuits is pitching the idea that the who go to heaven, who go to hell is kind of predestinate. So only European can go to heaven, and other civilizations are kind of they're worshiping idols and they don't know God and things like that. So the Jesuit is also creating a set of texts that is more negative on China. So the debate about China within the church at that time is called the right controversy. That is because they find that the Chinese people worship ancestor, and then the Jesuits is saying that it is not superstitious. It is not worshiping idol. They are just teaching their kids how to respect elderly people. So there's nothing wrong about it. But the Jesuits is saying that it is worshiping of idols and it is against Christian principle. So this Jesuits and Gentiles debate in the 17th century really continue in the 18th century into the Enlightenment thinkers' different views on China and debate about China. The Jesuits is very interesting because they publish a lot of books about China, and it becomes very practical manual about how to do things. For example, in their books about China, there's pages and pages about how to grow, how to make silk, for example, the technology and things like that. So even today, many historians, Western historians working on China, use Jesuit text as a source of what is going on in China back in the 18th century. But of course, and then you go to there, you find that there's some real representation of what was going on in China at that time. But at the same time, there's a lot of misrepresentation and exaggeration, and the admiration is very one-sided. They systematically overlook the problems and the so-called dark side of the Chinese system. So it is the same as today's debate between admirer and the China threat, or more negative people with more negative view on China. So they cherry pick and exaggerate the reality that they think benefit their argument. And their debate is really not driven by what is actually going on in China, but it is driven by the internal politics in the church between the Jesuits and the Jesuits about whether we should convert the people outside of Europe, or to hold the view that they are destined to be going to hell, so that's hopeless, so don't do it. So it is really the power struggle within the church about this. And in the kind of Jesuit text about China, that you can always see this kind of view of Confucius as a kind of gentle man with actually fair skin, and standing in front of a lot of books, and many art historians will find that actually it is a very common style to portray the great man and the elite in Europe at the same time. So it's a great man standing in front of a stack of books, and also maybe some artifact that represent how knowledgeable that man is. So it is really they are trying to tell the Europeans that the Chinese essentially, and the Confucianist culture is not so radically different from Western culture, so this is the universalism part, and then they also keep telling people that China knows about God, and you look at their classic text, there's a reference to the heaven, there's a reference to so it is actually, it's interesting, it's even today that the Chinese translation of the Bible, they use the word Sangdi as the translation of God, and then it is established since the Jesuits' time that it is the term that Chinese philosopher and Confucius in ancient time keep referring to some kind of mandate of heaven and heaven. And the Jesuits think that it is actually reference to God. So the Chinese people in the ancient text, they are close to God, and then they can easily be Christianized because they just need to rediscover the Christian root that somehow lost over the ages. And of course, and when you go into the Enlightenment period, and it leads to some ridiculous theory. Of course, that there's one English Enlightenment, actually Scottish Enlightenment thinker who have this theory about universal language, because at that time they abide by the kind of a church interpretation of world history and counting the dates and years of Bible and thinking that human history since the creation is like 5,000, 6,000 years. So that was the dominant theory at the time. But when they found out from the Jesuits' text about China, and the Chinese civilization that is a continuity of like 5,000 yees, with the written language and everything has this long continuity. So the theory is that theory number one, that is the Chinese civilization is long, and the origin of the language can trace back to close to the time of creation. Actually, if you believe that the creation, the time from creation to early modern is just 5,000-6,000 years. So then they have a theological question about then what is the Chinese language that is so continuous, because we know that there's the Tower of Babel and then the confusion of tongue and all that. So they do the count calendar according to the Bible and find that actually the Chinese language spent longer than before the confusion of tongue. So they must have been speaking the language of Adam and Eve. So there's a theory of lingua endemica, saying that actually Chinese language is the language of God. And they are too far away, they didn't go to construct the Tower of Babel, so they didn't undergo the confusion of tongue. So it is the only Asian language that survived the confusion of tongue. So we should all learn Chinese. It might not be a good idea to advertise Chinese language program nowadays. I wouldn't believe that anymore. But in the Enlightenment, that is a prominent idea. So everybody should learn Chinese because it is the original language of atoms. But among Enlightenment, that it is a big fashion because the Jesuits discover that this long continuation of Chinese civilization, and compared to the dominant chronology of the world according to the Bible calendars, they think that really the Chinese civilization in this origin can trace back to very close to creation. And so to learn Chinese language is better than learning Roman history and any other thing to get closer to the original intent of God, because they are closest in their origins and they have this continuity of language and civilization and knowledge. So it is the kind of idea the Jesuits try to portray in Europe. Of course, that they have their own agenda that to make Europeans believe it is the case, that they get more funding and more resources to continue to go to the China and Asia to their conversion, global conversion campaign. And of course, then so this China's lingua endemica is a dominant theory. There's a lot of parallel theory that repeats that it's the one of the early mathematicians who invented calculus, and actually he has written, and many scientists at that time in the Enlightenment actually written about China and find that is one of the ancient texts in China called I Ching, actually that there's already some idea of the Book of Change, that you still see this kind of not as popular as the Art of War that in Barnes novels and plays, that is not this kind of Chinese classic text, but the Book of Change is another kind of basically it's kind of a horoscope or kind of thing that there's a lot of content about how you can predict the future and stuff like that. So today it is seen as a kind of not religious but superstitious kind of text, but back in the Enlightenment they think that there's calculus ideas there, and then we should learn calculus by translating and reading the books. More important, actually, that is not this representation. And you look at Adam Smith and Wealth of Nations, which is inspired by the Physioquest, the French Physioquest, for example, the Brenet. They have long section talking about China. And even Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, that people overlook it nowadays and skip those references to China. But you really can find that there's a lot of passage about China in Adam Smith's application of a free market and laissez-faire. And basically the idea came from Corneille and Physiocrats. And Corneille and Physiocrats in France, even they start to have admitting Chinese students to do a PhD and things like that. And because that Corneille and want to, the French Physiocrats want to learn how the Chinese economy works, and actually they recruit through the Jesuits, recruit Chinese scholars and to go to Paris and to interview him and then study with them. To figure out what is going on in China, and then Corneille saying that the idea of free market actually came from China. Actually, it's very interesting nowadays in contemporary and in historical representation. China means they are against free trade, so it is why that the British are saying that they need to open more because they are against free trade. So we need to use gunboat to open their border, and they don't want to trade with the outside world. So it is the standard narrative. But back in the 18th century during Enlightenment, China is seen as a perfect example of free market and how it works and why the Chinese empire was so prosperous. So Europe should imitate, because they are not talking about China trading with other civilizations. They are talking about the geographical fact that the whole Chinese empire is bigger than the whole of Europe. And then they are finding out that when you move and sell and buy goods among this province of the Chinese empire, you don't need to pay tax, there's no tariff. So basically, the whole Chinese empire is a free trade zone. So they are thinking that if China can do it in that geographical scale, why Europe cannot do it among the European nations, which is combined together is about as big as China. So this whole idea about, look at China is so prosperous with all this silk and porcelains and so well made and so cheap because they have this kind of a low tariff situation within the empire. So this labor and goods and raw material can move freely within the Chinese empire, which is again as big as or bigger than Europe. So basically, the earlier physiocrats got the idea of this free market and why it worked and how it worked. Because in the beginning, there's tariff and all these kind of taxation regimes regulating trade and movement of people between domains of dukes and even within France, that trade among different domains of different aristocrat domain is not free. That it is relatively difficult to move people and goods around. So when they first talk about the free market, we now assume that it is a revolutionary idea that they haven't tried it before. So it's really courageous for them to advocate this idea. But if you look at the original text, they are thinking that actually it is not lawful, that they are just saying that what is happening in China we should imitate. And also Chinese politics, and that is the point of debate among the Enlightenment thinkers. The early Enlightenment thinkers in the mid-18th century, like Bataille, they all say that not even economy, but also the politics of China should be the model of Europe. The Chinese political system is so good, so it is one of the image from one of the Jesuits text. So it is like a manual about how to make silk, from growing the worms and then getting the yarning and then making textiles. So this Jesuit book is very popular in Europe, not because of the religious content, but because of the practicality of the content about how to make things. And they are really popular and influence a lot of scientists and Enlightenment thinkers. So not only at the technology and economic level, but also at a political level, which is getting very controversial at that time. For example, Bataille is talking about, is quote from him, the human mind may certainly not imagine a better government than in operation and everything decided by the great tribunals, subordinate to one another, whose members are admitted only after several stringent examinations. Everything in China is governed by these tribunals. It is impossible under such an administration for the emperor to exercise an arbitrary power. Now, if there has ever been a state in which the life, honor, and wealth of man has been protected by laws, it is the Empire of China. What should for the European princes do when they hear of such examples? Admire and approach, but above all imitate. So basically, it is a misrepresentation, of course. That it's just like today, many people think that the authoritarian system of China and the state-led capitalism in China is much better than the liberal democracy and things like that. You still hear about this kind of talk today, that this authoritarian system is superior to to a liberal democracy. But at that time, Voltaire is not talking about the Chinese authoritarianism versus a liberal democracy. At that time, there was not yet liberal democracy in Europe yet, but he's talking about centralized bureaucracy versus kind of a fragmented aristocratic kind of situation in which even the king cannot decide a lot of things at the ground level, which is decided by all these aristocrats on the ground. So Voltaire is really advocating China as a good example of centralized bureaucracy. That you don't have these aristocrats in the local area that stand in the way, and you have a unified rule. So it is really what the early Enlightenment thinker is talking about is an enlightened despot kind of thing. That's like the English queen, the French king, and all that. And in fact, that Voltaire used to work for the French king, and then he was persecuted, and then he was exiled in Prussia to work for Frederick the Great. So his Voltaire career is really to work for this emperor of Europe to advocate the case that this emperor and this king and this monarch should centralize their power to crush the aristocrats. So it is the idea of Enlightenment. It's basically this kind of a despot, enlightened despot, so to speak. So it's Voltaire, but at the same time that you see starting to see a group of, and Voltaire again, that got all this idea about how this Chinese bureaucracy and centralized power work from the Jesuits, because he was trained in the Jesuit school, and at that time many European intellectuals actually read Jesuits writing when they want to learn more about the long-Western civilizations. But at the same time, so it's later on kind than Hegel. But Montesquieu, when he's talking about China, that he's a contemporary of Voltaire and debate with Voltaire, and he's portraying a more dark view of China, that China is the despotic state, the principle of which is fear. So basically, it is kind of a dictatorship and despotism argument, and it has something to do with actually that both Voltaire and Montesquieu and the people who with like-minded ideas are the same. Basically, it is the two sides of the same coin. They emphasize different things. And why they disagree is not much determined by what is going on in China, but the internal politics of Europe. For example, I mentioned that Voltaire's career is with these monarchs. He's the advisors and writer for these monarchs, while Montesquieu is a French aristocrat who's fighting the centralizing monarch. So he's advocating a kind of aristocratic parliament and empowering the parliament made up by, like the UK one, that the early parliament is a kind of assembly of aristocrats. They want to restrain the power of the monarch. So the early Enlightenment thinker who argued against the case of despotic China and portray a more dark view of China, they are all with this kind of aristocrat trying to restrain the power of the monarch, while Voltaire is a representative of centralizing monarch who work for the monarch and actually got his living from these monarchs. So it is basically, you already see this split between a group of Enlightenment thinkers who think that China is bad and it is dark, it is despotic, and there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of freedom, against a group of Enlightenment thinkers. Like Voltaire would say that China is a good example of Enlightenment. You have a kind of enlightened despot up there, and everything is fair. But of course, there's some, not only rhetoric, but there's some real influence on development in Europe. For example, there's people who look at the history of entrance examination for bureaucrats that started in the Prussian Empire, and people find that there is some Chinese connection, that they get it from the Jesuits, that they did the examination to become a bureaucrat in China. Of course, that more modern historians find that the examination in China is not what you think as really meritocratic. That it is a kind of a misrepresentation, because the examination has a lot of cheating going on, and then there's kind of a same clansman connection that you have. So it is why all these people who got degree and did well in exam cluster in certain area, because these people who are included in the bureaucracy, they know the exam questions in advance, and so they're running all this school to tell the people what they're going to ask, so you can actually, they have a model answer, they prepare and go and exam, and then the poor kids in faraway province without this connection, they are clueless, and then they didn't do well and things like that. So there's a lot of this kind of thing going on. But the representation of it as a kind of meritocratic selection So China is a meritocracy, but a lot of aristocracy system. Is very influential in Europe. The early state builder who tried to build bureaucracy using this examination or meritocratic procedure to select a civil servant. So it has some influence, even though the influence has come from this misrepresentation of what is actually the case in the Chinese examination. And so in the mid-18th century, these two groups of Enlightenment thinkers, one is more positive, one is more negative about Chinese political system, is like half and half. But going into the late 18th century, the entire wing of the Enlightenment, that is admiral of China, despotic or centralized monarchical regime is losing influence, and then all Enlightenment thinkers in the later period, in the late 18th century and onwards, they are all critiquing China for this being despotic. And this very widely quoted passage from Keynes and Hegel, of course, that I don't need to repeat, but so there's a really shift of tide of the view on China, and of course it has something to do with the shift of intellectual current in Europe itself. That earlier in the 18th century, people were saying that, thinking that this kind of enlightened despot and monarchical order, centralized monarchy, is the future, and then it really brings reforms and standardization of measurements, standardization of taxation, and things like that. So they are progress. But in the late 18th century, when this idea of popular sovereignty started to spring up, that this kind of a monarchical order can be good, being discarded, and then at the same time, they turned dark on to a darker view and negative view on China, and then after this, the image turned against China, that you can see that in the late 18th century and all the way to 19th century, that it is from another Jesuit, later Jesuits text on Confucius and Lao Tzu as the supposed founders of another religion, the Taoism in China. And you see that the representation is very different compared to the earlier one, that Confucius as a kind of a fair-skinned gentleman scholar standing in front of the books, and then you see this kind of more guide kind of try to portray Confucius in more racist manner, and he never didn't quite trim the beard, and there's a lot of long fingernails that is not showing here. But and the same as, and even the Lao Tzu is, again in the 18th century, that beside Confucius, Lao Tzu is also, because he's supposed to be the one who is responsible for I Ching, the book of change that according to many mathematicians has some secret of calculus in there. But now in the late 18th century, he's portrayed as kind of like a demon, and even have is it horn or something? That, so it really visualized the turn of the tide about China. And then I find that actually this is all the way in the 19th century. I don't want to get into it too much, but it's the same thing. But I look at the European. I will get to this a bit later. The European representation of other civilization, like the Arab civilization, according to Edward Said, and many, they see similar kind of change in the 18th century, before the mid 18th century, and then in the late 18th century, there is a universal or kind of across the board turn against non-Western civilization. That before the late 18th century, there's more admiration, even though the admiration might be based on some distorted, exaggerated representation, to a more negative view on Eastern civilization. Not only China, but people find the same thing regarding, for example, Hinduism and Muslim and things like that. And it has something to do with this kind of change in time consciousness, and in the case of China as in the case of other places, because one important motivation for people, or reason why people think that Chinese civilization and other Oriental civilizations are great, because before the late 18th century, there's a so-called the time consciousness, still from the medieval and Christian religion. That is, human civilizations are in the course of running down. So we are most pure and most closest to God in the beginning, in the creation. But over time, there's corruption going on. So longer we move away from the origin, the farther away we are from God. So basically, it is wheel of history about running down, declining. So basically it is the time consciousness that represent the Renaissance, and because that we are so bad now, this Black Death and all this crazy thing. So let's go back to the earlier time to find a golden age, a lost golden age. So this kind of time consciousness is still around nowadays. It's all this kind of the rhetoric of all this kind of xenophobism and white nationalism and all this. It's all about this. There's a lost golden age. We are running down from there, so we need to go back to a better past. So basically, it is the dominant time consciousness in Europe up until the late 18th century. Before the late 18th century, they have this time consciousness, and then they find out Chinese civilization has a long continuity. So they have this theory about they are closer to their origin. They corrupt less than Europe. So when because they are still reading the classic text written thousands of years ago. So if you go to learn Chinese civilization, learn their classic text, learn their ancient text, so we can get closer to God. And get closer, we discover that golden age and how this golden age works. And at that time, economically and historically, that people still find that the evidence is compelling. At that time in the 18th century, Chinese economy measured in per capita nutrition intake and all these kind of measures really more advanced than Europe in many parts. In Europe, it is established as a fact. So when they go to China and find a prosperous economically and technologically advanced empire that has a lot of respect of ancient stuff and non-continuity, so they combine with their worldview about European history has been running down since the Roman Empire and since the creation. So they have this admiration of China and other ancient civilizations. So let us learn about the lost golden age of humanity, about the lost true knowledge about God by learning from this ancient civilization. So it is a time consciousness at that time, before the mid-18th century, but after the mid-18th century, that the time consciousness of European intellectual change, that the idea of progress start to take root, and then the world will become human being is actually going better and better. The old stuff we need to leave behind. We need to try new things and advance to a higher level. So it is this time conscious about the future is better than the past. Start to replace the old time conscious, the past is better than the future. And so this kind of large continuity and the respect of ancient texts and ancient tradition in all these Eastern civilization, including China, become a disadvantage. They think that it represents stagnation. So this idea about China and all other Eastern civilization is a stagnation, representation of stagnation start to take hold. But before the late 18th century, it is seen as a kind of an advantage. It's not that they expect them, that they are reading all these 1,000 years old and still practicing their politics and economy according to this ancient text. It is a good thing because they are closer to their old golden age. But after the idea of progress took hold, that then that this kind of respect of ancient text and ancient way of doing things become a disadvantage and seen as a representation of stagnation. So you see this kind of shift across the board with regard to European representation and other Eastern civilization. That I don't have time to get into this. The Mongolian invasion is also very particular about China. That's why that's this kind of negative view about China taking over the world. And I trace back, it has something to do with this European memory and representation of the Mongol invasion. Because at some point, at the worst time of Middle Age, that the Mongol Empire really tried to invade Europe. They go all the way to Poland and on footsteps of Vienna. So there's in the early modern time, there's a lot of text about this kind of horror of Mongol invasion. And so it is this kind of origin of this China threat that for some time I cannot quite understand why I look at the propaganda of some of the most racist organizations like KKK in the US, that they talk about this kind of racial invasion. They use the word Mongols to refer to all East Asians. I don't know why. That because they use the word Mongols to talk about Chinese, Japanese, and everybody. And I don't understand why until I get into this history of this kind of memory and representation of Mongol invasion. So it is really deep-seated in the Western culture. But it's another thing. And another, I close by looking at this parallel discussion. It is controversial, but it has some real evidence supporting it is the scholars in Cornell who passed away long ago, a few years ago, is Martin Barrow, and has this Black Athena thesis. Because, and he find that about the same thing, that before the mid-18th century, European Enlightenment thinkers and European intellectuals, when they talk about Greek civilization as the root of Western civilization, they emphasize that actually Greek civilization has a lot of influence from Egypt and from North African, from African influence. So it is of Black Athena. So this is Afro-Asiatic roots of classical civilization. And many European thinkers accept this, but after the mid-18th century, that they suddenly deny this kind of African root or Northern African or Egyptian roots of the classical Greco-Roman civilization and try to establish them as a standalone civilization, totally radically distinct from all other non-Western civilization. It is a kind of and that the Black Athena thesis is that this is not it's a recent thing, that this conception about Greco-Roman civilization as a standalone civilization, totally not related to other non-Western civilization. It came along in the late 18th century, so there has been debate, and there's 3 big books about this Black Athena thesis, but they happen about the same time. So it is why that and people find that the Egyptian pyramid, the Europeans know that they are there for a long time, and then they don't find anything odd about it. They think that because the Asian civilization are great. So it is not a surprise that they managed to build that, because according to this old-time consciousness of Asian people are better than our contemporary people, so of course that they can build that pyramid. But after this time consciousness of present is always better than the past, and future is always better than the present, and the past being primitive and things like that, they suddenly find that the pyramid is very puzzling. Why they can build that? Then there's all this crazy theory about UFO and things that is run up, that because they cannot just understand why these ancient people and the dark-skinned Asian people can build this huge thing that they couldn't quite figure out how to build that. But in the 18th century and before, they don't find it puzzling at all, because it is very natural that they can build it, because they're more ancient. They are better and things like that. So it is all this kind of Enlightenment idea of progress really has a cost of this kind of about affecting the European understanding of non-Western civilization that supposedly didn't change much compared to early modern Europe. And it is about European and Western conception of China, and also about Western European conception of other non-Western civilization. It's not only about early modern period, and as I mentioned a lot of examples, it continued well into 21st century. So it's something that we still need to tackle and deal with our teaching and understanding of this stuff. That is what I want to share, and look forward to your question. Thank you.
We still have a good amount of time for discussion.
Was there much back and forth among the various Europeans and the Chinese?
Yeah, there's a lot of back and forth. This is the part that I skipped. I'm glad that you asked this question, because after the late 18th century, more negative view of China becomes dominated. So everybody turned against China and other Asian civilizations. But in the early 19th century, there's a time that is this what I call the romantic sinologies sprung up. There's a group of so James Neck is one of the last and continue to write in a positive tone about China. And you can see the same among Indologists and scholar of Muslim, that in the mid and also South Asianists as well, before the late 19th century, there's a lot of sinologies, Indologies, and all these people. They start to talk about Eastern civilization, even though at that time they are already colonies or semi-colonies. They talk about their civilization in a positive way. It has something to do with actually the movement of Romanticism in 19th century, because as you know that there is a movement against this excessive rationality so we try to revive some kind of a non-rational or irrational sensitivity and emotion. So this is the movement in the literature and in arts and in the study of Eastern civilization. It got this influence, and they find that actually to get away, to escape from the excessive rationality of modernity and all this dark side of modernity, that industrial pollution at that time starting to surface, and then all this kind of uprooted peasant community and things like that. So we can go back and then look at the Eastern civilization and find inspiration. So actually that many people who study the modern history of like New Age and yoga and all this kind of thing, and actually has connected to this 19th century romanticist portrayal of the East as a kind of a refuge from the kind of industrial revolution and all these problems associated with modern state and military and industrialism and uprooted of peasants' communities and all these kind of things. So it's in the early 19th century there's a movement about this kind of more positive view about Eastern civilization. Of course, the dark part of it is this kind of free of Aryan thing, that they find this kind of Aryan race has this root to South Asia, and so they trace it back to this ancient India or South Asian or Hindu civilization to find the root of European that is not contaminated, quote unquote, I have to be careful about by Jewish influence. So it is this kind of troubling part of the Romanticism, and this romantic, they call it Orientalism. Actually, it's very interesting that now emphasize Orientalism is a bad word, but in the 19th century they have a World Congress of Orientalists. So it is a job title. I'm an Orientalist. My job is Orientalist. So it is a job title. It is I'm teaching in the Department of Orientalism. That is established and acceptable kind of way to refer to a study of Eastern civilization. So this is back and forth, and again this change, this romantic conception of Eastern civilization changed again in the late 19th century after the scramble for Africa and what historians call high imperialism. They suddenly turned dark again, and they grew this the Dutch sinologists that all of a sudden again turned from admiration to very negative view on China. So there's a lot of back and forth, and I can continue into the 20th century as well. That's not me for now. Yeah.
I know you referenced a lot of the Jesuits. Were there any Protestants that
Yeah.
were involved?
Yes.
If so, what are some that?
Yeah. That's interesting that actually that James Slack is a Protestant priest, actually that stationed in colonial Hong Kong and translate all the Confucianist texts. So there's a parallel discussion among the Protestants, but because the Protestant is more decentralized than the Catholic Church, and so it is not less as dramatic as the so-called right controversy between the Jesuits and Gentiles. So yeah, you're right. In Protestantism and the parallel discussion, it's all about this: whether Chinese or other non-European people can get the grace. Do they get the grace of God? So again, that the Calvinists say they know that they're predestined to be. Some people are predestined to go to heaven. Some people are predestined to go to hell, and all these non-European people are destined to go to the hell. So this is what we use to Christianize them. And while other group of Protestants like the James Slack, I think I'm not sure, but I think he's a Presbyterian. That basically that they think that everybody can universally and equally get God's grace. So they have the responsibility to actually Christianize everybody. And of course, this kind of idea of God's grace is very deep-rooted as well, and even into some recent popular texts that you might heard of. There's Gun, Jumps and Steel and Jar Diamond. It's a very well written and very well researched books, and actually some people criticize him for getting the idea from all this 19th century idea of predestination, because at that time a lot of world historian and geographer in the 19th century, they translate this theory about God's grace, and some people are born to be damned, and some people are born to be destined to be saved, to combine it with geographical knowledge and explaining why Europe has capitalism and market industrialism and market development. It has something to do with climate. And because God put the European in the temperate climate in northwestern Europe, which has, the second part has some truism in it, because the climate really led to how you, the regime of how you divide your work and how much you accumulate and things like that, because in tropical area, it's very difficult to accumulate and develop a kind of a work system that European developed, because there's a lot of tropical disease. There's no winter, so tropical disease is very menacing, and it's very hot and very humid, and of course there's all very abundant. So you really, if you really want to force people to work, you need to have very draconian labor system like the slavery and plantation. While in temperate climate, you have a winter, it's not too cold, not too hot, and then you need to work a lot to save for the winter and things like that. So it is the theory that actually partially that Jesuits and advocate, and of course it's more complicated than that, and many people believe. And then in the 19th century, this idea is actually originated by the fact that why Europeans happen to be in this not too cold, the Goldilocks, not too cold, not too hot zone, that it is just right for capitalism. While all other people, even though they're very advanced, they have long history, but they are poorly put in a kind of tropical places that is not very good for developing this kind of modern economic system. So it is really that this kind of had a theological component in it, this geographical determinism about this economic development and things like that. Even today, like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore argued that they think that Singapore cannot make it without air conditioning. So the invention of air conditioning really make the tropical people finally can develop economically. So it is a kind of a different idea. But at that time in the 19th century, really the people have this idea and then connect to the theology about predestination and things like that. So it's related to this Christian idea about who can go to heaven, who cannot. So there's a religious root to it, even though it still influences our thinking nowadays.
The Chinese government talks currently a lot about harmony,
Yeah.
and uses that word specifically for a political purpose.
Yes.
It's been around for about 20 years,
Yeah.
but I was wondering if the roots are truly in the Enlightenment period,
Yeah.
in Confucius or in Lao Tzu, or
Yeah.
where they are tracing back that sort of
Yes.
focus
Yes.
on harmony and Zen and
Yeah.
all of those.
There's actually it's interesting, and it relates to how we teach about Confucianism and Chinese culture and things like that in a kind of a K-12 context as well. That in college level, I find it very difficult because of this long history about positive versus negative portrayal of China, which is both cherry picking, and this harmony is very exactly the thing that the Jesuits select from Confucianism, saying that it is an empire built on harmony, people reciprocity, and respect and things like that. But as a matter of fact, that I would say that the Jesuit is deliberately portray a positive image, which is not fake news. It is actually, there's some truism. It's not totally fabricated, but they systematically and deliberately overlook another part of this harmony discourse, that is this harmony based on hierarchy. That and a big part of Confucianism is that you need to learn to how to relate yourself with other human beings by learning how you relate yourself with your parents, with your grandparents. So they think that this kind of family orders is natural. You can observe in other mammals or other animals, and then so the parents and grandparents should be caring and paternalistic to their children, and the children should not question their parents. And then the important thing of that is it's not only about the family relation, and of course there's a gender thing, that men and women, wife and concubines and husband. And the Confucians emphasize this family relation because they think it is a foundation of all kind of relation. That you know, that like the book of filial piety is one of the Confucian concepts, that in the beginning and teaching how you kneel in front of your parents, and then they go on is that you as a kid you know how to do it. You have harmonious family relation. Then later on you can know how you relate yourself with the local officials and to the emperor, with extending or replicating this relation that you establish, and you learn how to deal with your parents and grandparents, and then you get to treat your officials as your parents and your emperor as a grandparent. And so basically it is this kind of harmonies, body politics based on familial relation. So it is the crush of the idea. And of course, and then Jesuits and the Chinese government right now talk about harmony by trying to hide the part about this hierarchical part that and keep even many respectable scholars who study and write about Confucianism, they try to escape, try to hide that part. That like Harvard professor right now in Peking University is Du Weiming. He's the most important authority on Confucianism, and he even writes some texts for general reader about Confucianism. And he talked about the essence of Confucianism as he advocates is that is emphasize on education, which is true, and emphasize on humanity. So this is not a kind of so human-centered. They focus on human welfare. So that is also true, and emphasize on harmonies and reciprocity is also true. But you look at throughout his works, there's much being talked about this gender role and parent and paternalistic kind of conception about familial relation and how it is kind of a blueprint for all kind of social relation. And at some point, the emperor in China in the 18th century even they have a huge Confucian text about on friendship. The emperor says that friendship is bad. Only bad people have friends because friendship is a horizontal relation. So they think that is bad because only bad people will have this horizontal relation. They must be conspiring against the authority. So only bad people have friends. Good people don't have friends. Relate to one another through an indirect link to they are both loyal to the emperor. So they are relations that me and you are the same because we are loyal to the same emperor. So all relations go through that emperor. If you establish autonomous horizontal relation, it's bad. So the emperor of 18th century, Yongjing Emperor, even write this very famous text on friendship, basically attacking friendship. That, don't make friends. And so it is very different from European Enlightenment idea about this kind of horizontal civil society, whole idea about civil society. Of course, the other difficult thing is that Confucianism is complicated. So it is the conservative version of Confucianism. And there was used to have a more liberal version of Confucianism that flourished in the late 18th century, and actually some sinologists nowadays even call the guy the Martin Luther of Confucianist school. This guy called Wang Yangming in the 16th century, and he incorporated some Buddhist philosophy into Confucianism because in the late 17th century there was a dynastic transition from the Ming Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty, and at the end of the Ming Dynasty there's starting to have this idea of Wang Yangming thing that the Tao or the way is not objectively implanted in the world, but it is implanted in everybody's heart. So everybody with self-reflection can get to know the way. So it is kind of a very, it's like the Reformation, that you don't need to go through the Catholic Church to get to God. You can have this kind of a from the ground up kind of understanding of God and things like that. So it is about the same time, 17th century. And then related to that, they have different version of friendship. They have a different book on friendship that they talk about this kind of actually everybody has this way implanted in their heart. They just need to discover it. And to communicate with your peers can help you with discovery. So actually for this brand of Confucianism, friendship is good. It's good to make friends. And politically in the 17th century, that a lot of Confucius academy, not related to China, not related to the government, start to flourish. So these private academies, and later it become kind of opposition party that writing article against the emperor and things like that. And then of course the dynastic transition came in the 17th century, and the Manchu came, and we established the authority of the kind of Confucianism that is very hierarchical, and then they actually outlaw the more liberal strain of Confucianism. This kind of liberal strain of Confucianism got attention again in the early 20th century when the Qing Empire is collapsing and a bunch of intellectuals try to have a revolution. So it is also internal variation of this Confucianism. That the other difficult the thing to talk about Confucianism and Chinese culture is again that we talk about Western culture and European culture. There's all this complication and tension. You have different order within the Catholic Church, you have the Reformation, within the Protestant culture, you have Calvinism and all other kind of different types, Franciscan, and all this kind of a complication, and Enlightenment, and their different factions. But when we get to all kind of non-Western civilization, it's just one whole very standard, even reified and understanding that that is another complication. That is very difficult, and people start to lose patience when you talk about there's different kind of Confucianism, and we explain different scholars and things like that. But it is the real complication we have.
I'm wondering if you have perhaps an explanation for why there is this move from a positive view of China to a negative view of China as an economic, is it social, political, religious, or is it all?
Yeah, it's all of those, but politically, the political reason is very important. Like in the Enlightenment in the 18th century, China didn't change dramatically before and during and after the late 18th century, but the European dominant view on China suddenly changed. It has something to do with this idea of progress, and then the idea that a centralized monarch is not a good idea, that let's have more decentralized system, democratic system, and the idea of public sovereignty. So it has something to do with what is going on within you. So again, that is the same in the 20th century. That right now now that in the China Studies Circle there's a lot of debate about how to see China today, and then all of a sudden, not only because of Donald Trump, that all the talk in the government level and mainstream level is very negative about China. And China did change a little bit more to the worse in recent years, but not that drastic that justify they can explain all this sudden shift. It has something to do with internal politics about how people conceive of globalization and whether it's an opportunity or a threat and things like that. So it is the internal politics that very much driving the shift in the field. I'm an advocate of more complicated nuanced view of everything. Because I'm not saying that all these people have positive view and negative view. I'm very reluctant to make a verdict about who is right and who is wrong, because you find truism and fabrication in both sides. Because the reality is much more complicated.
So I teach high school, and a significant number of my students are international students
Yeah.
from China.
Yeah.
So I'm always trying to educate myself more
Yeah.
about what I can assume they have as
Yeah.
background knowledge.
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering if I know it's sort of
Yeah.
like the inverse of what we're talking about,
Yeah.
but I was wondering if you could share anything with me about how
Yeah.
the Enlightenment is taught
Yeah.
in China. Like,
Yeah.
what are some like mainstream Orthodox
Yes,
ideas about this era and
Yeah.
about the arrival of Jesuit missionaries
Yeah.
and things like that?
Yeah, that's interesting, because teaching of history is very political in China. That's how you teach it, and they keep changing the party line. But the standard line, like the Jesuits, that they talk about it in a more positive light until recently. That because there's always missionary is always bad in the standard party line. They're all imperialists. Serving which is again true in some way, but not all true, because you look at all these complications. So in the Marxist philosophy, this missionary is not very good. Though when they talk about the Jesuits, they do talk about more mutual understanding and facilitating. And of course, Marco Polo is very good in China. That bring, because the Jesuits is talking about good thing about China in Europe, and so is Marco Polo. So it is very well perceived, particularly in the time when China is more open in the 80s and 1990s, that they want to have this reform and opening and mutual understanding with presidents. So they have a relatively positive view on the Jesuits and Marco Polo and all that. And in terms of Enlightenment, of course, they have this Marxist view of all this Enlightenment thinking lead to Marxism, Leninism, and that to lead to the party state and one-party system. So it is they are teaching it in this kind of mode that is of course that they will again highlight some and not highlight some depending on the era. In the 1980s, that they really highlight the anti-authoritarian and like brave thinking and part of Enlightenment in school curriculum, or even in many popular reading. So be courageous and think out of the box, and that kind of part of Enlightenment. And in more recent years, that they will not emphasize that much, and so it changed in terms of their teaching, and need to be really be aware of this kind of background knowledge that they have.
So related to that idea of the party line, to what extent might Voltaire and the Jesuits' idea of the Chinese bureaucracy have been based on the way that the Chinese bureaucrats themselves wanted to represent their system?
Yeah, they're very much into Voltaire, that it is translated, and of course all the praise about the Chinese Empire that is being translated. And actually there is even some you can check out his book, the Daniel A. Bell, that write a lot about Confucianism. And he's teaching in Tsinghua University in Beijing, but he's a controversial figure because he's trying to see that Confucianism is good. It is advocating meritocracy, it's advocating humanism, and it is better than Western system, even better than liberal democracy. So it's thesis number one that he keeps advocating, and he really read a lot of books for scholars or also for general reader. And the thesis number two is that he thinks that the Communist Party of China nowadays is a real true believer and practitioner of that Confucianist system. So he's writing that the current regime is based on meritocracy, lot dictatorship, and things like that. So it's getting controversial, and he gets a lot of criticism even within China. But he's one of the representatives, and of course that the Chinese authority love him. That a Westerner talking about the fact that the current system in China is, even though it's not liberal democracy, it is actually better than liberal democracy because it's like the philosopher kings. So there's meritocratically selected leaders have unlimited power, so only working for the good of the people. So it is the kind of version of representation of Confucianism and Chinese culture that is being emphasized in China now.
Yeah, but what about at the time, in the 18th century, would a Chinese person reading Voltaire have said, oh yeah, he understands us perfectly, or would they have said this is all?
In the 18th century, the translation is one way. That a lot of Chinese text being translated in Europe, but not many works is translated into in China from Europe until the late 19th century and early 20th century by the revolutionaries. And then at that time, it's very interesting. It's all these revolutionaries are translating all the book that is racist about China. Because it's so bad, it's so messed up, let us westernize and overthrow the dynasty and things like that. So they're into all these kind of, even a lot of social Darwinist texts are being translated in China because it's like we are held back by this backward culture, and we are going to wipe out in the competition among races, and so we need to really revolution and things like that. And it's very interesting that so when the Western text being translated in large scale in China in the late 19th century and early 20th century, when a lot of negative view of Europe is translated into China. And even the early Communist Party become popular upon this text. One of the most well-known popularly Chinese writer in the early 20th century that has been translated into many European languages, including English, is called Lu Xun. That is one of the left-wing writers, and the Communist Party still enshrine him as one of the pioneer of new thinkings and Mayforth movement and all that. And Lu Xun is a kind of represent the kind of intellectuals that trash Chinese culture, basically. And then he is educated as a medical doctor, and then read all the books about why Chinese culture is so bad and negative, and then so he write about a lot of short and long articles to talk about this kind of the dark side of Chinese nationality. So it is for the cause of the revolution. So this is why we have the revolution, of course. And then all this negative view about China get translated and used by the revolutions. And one of the dark consequences of the Cultural Revolution started by Mao. The Mao is basically in the 60s. The whole idea about Cultural Revolution is that all cultures are bad, Confucianism, Buddhism, and all that. So we need to crush it and send the young people to break the idols and statue of gods and everything. So it is still kind of in Chinese intellectual circle, it's still this kind of tension about negative view and positive views, and it's really, really very contentious and complicated.
So I have a question for you. So do you think that the bias which exists today in China, you know, and the lack of intellectual freedom,
Yes.
do you think it was the same in the 18th century in China?
Yeah,
Where everything was kind of a one-way street?
Yes. Yeah, in the 18th century it's the same as today. That it's very interesting that history is a very political thing. That like 10 years ago, that the CCTV, the China Central Television, has all this very popular historical drama portraying the 18th century emperor of China. that is a big hit, and so they actually, I see some of them, and I find actually that they are making explicit parallel. I think that the 18th century that emperor Yongzheng is very good, and then there's a lot of saying that they put in the mouth of that emperor in that TV series. Actually, the exact saying of Chinese leader and things like that. So they make the parallel and connection. And then Yongzheng emperor, and actually that again about that's one great historian of China at that period, and write a lot of book for general audience by the name of Jonathan Spence. Has a little book about Yongzheng emperor, and he is the most compulsively the dictatorial emperor of that time. That before him in the 17th century, there's some space for distance among this. So as you're loyal, you are allowed to speak out your mind and things like that. Actually, on friendship, the latest version of it is written by Yongzheng himself. Saying that friendship is bad, and the only relation that you can have is the loyalty, vertical loyalty, rather than horizontal relation with your peers. So Yongzheng is, and he set up the secret police and things like that, and assassinate people and persecute intellectuals. So in the 18th century China, that's very similar to today's China, that this kind of different views are not tolerated. Again, that it is a certain moment in the 18th century, but in the 19th century when the dynasty becomes weakened, and after the Opium War, actually, that there are different views being voiced first secretly, but later on more openly among the literati, the scholar official class. And so it changed, but in the 18th century really is the heyday of the empire, the heyday of the economic prosperity, but also the heyday of this is why the Enlightenment thinker like Montesquieu and Diderot and all this criticized China for this lack of freedom of speech and freedom of thinking. That they still think that Europe is better than China in that regard because of the freedom of speech. But again, that this kind of a view in the early 18th century or mid 18th century didn't gain traction because the economic reality influenced people thinking. They still think that it's just like today. When after 2008 there's a financial crisis, it seems that Europe and US and economy in trouble, while China is like growing very rapidly, lost scratched by the financial crisis. With this economic comparison, really kind of is very tempting for people to think that actually their system, even though there's no freedom, but it works economically, so it's better than liberal democracy. And the same in the 18th century, that when they see all these silk and porcelain coming up from China, all the report about China being so prosperous while Europe is not so, and there's war and famine and things like that, and many people really think that that system of centralized unlimited power of the monarchs is really not tracked by aristocrats, and anybody is actually better. So again, that is really has something to do with economic situation like today.
We still have a few minutes if you want to ask another question or raise another issue. There you go.
Have you seen the parody video of that professor video? That there's a parody.
The parody version of it?
Where he's replaced by the panda bear.
Oh, I need to check it out. It's very interesting.
Yeah. You can't show it in public school, drops the F-bomb, but it's,
oh, really?
it's quite funny, making fun of that special interest group.
Yeah,
so.
Very interesting.
I was just wondering, you kind of saw this with the events at Tiananmen Square and the more recent in Hong Kong.
Yes.
The Western ideas of democracy, how did that affect kind of Chinese views? Obviously, you had the official government views, but just lower down in society.
It's actually very interesting that there's research about it. It is a kind of a topic of debate about how ordinary people, not the government, view liberal democracy and Western kind of system and freedom of speech and things. There's a debate about it actually. That in the 1980s and 1990s of China, there's no doubt about it that is the liberal thinking is dominating among the intellectuals and non-official scholars, and it's only the government advocating this dictatorship is better than democracy thing, and people really don't believe in it and things like that. But in more recent years, and more scholars find that it is less and less the case. And it seems that many intellectuals and ordinary people still starting to think that actually the dictatorship is better than democracy. So it is a thorny issue because you never have a way to actually find out with the censorship and things like that. But I do think that there's some kind of sign that in the online media and things like that, you see some kind of admiration of democracy and things. But when you post this kind of thing, it can only exist like for a few hours, and they really hire a huge number of people to monitor this post and then take it down. So you never know the real thinking. It is the problem of research in China. But there are also more evidence showing that this electionism and the real there's people who truly believe that the Chinese dictatorship system is better than, particularly after the financial crisis, that they divided it, and now they really think that I actually know people, young people, educated people, wealthy people who really think that 1989 that the Chinese government did a good job. If the student protesters got their way, China would not have been that prosperous, things like that. So it is. I believe that there will be people who truly believe in it rather than just government propaganda. But also there's sign that there's undercurrent. But you never know because like it's difficult to do research on China. Like recent books about trust of the government. That people do survey about compare different countries, how people trust and how much the citizens trust the government. And they do the survey, they time and again find that the Chinese people trust the government most. It is a high trust society because the people trust everything the government say and do, while the Indian and the British and the American don't trust the government. Because it has something to do with the methodology of research, because they get connected with some local universities in China, which is government universities, and then they go out to ask people with a souvenir. I'm from this university, the Chinese government, and I'm asking you, do you trust the government? And then you go to India, everybody say, oh, I don't trust the government, they're lying all the time, and things like that. And because they know that there's no consequence of it. But in China, you do this kind of survey, people, you are from that university, that is a government university, and they suspect that you are from the government, and you ask me whether I trust the government. Everybody answered, you trust the government. So the result is standard, that China, comparatively, internationally, has the highest level of trust of the government compared to all other countries in the world, because you never know the reality, that in behavior, you know that people really don't trust the government. That they chose to trust the food regulations, so they have to divide, they think they're supposed to save food, foreign brand and things like that. So it's very difficult to tell about the real, but we really need to like engage in deep dialogue and things like that, and it's really very, very complex.
All right, thank you very much.